Morning. Thank you for joining us here. I think I'm going to go ahead and start. If we finish early, then that'll just give you time to get there quicker to your lunch. We are in this quarter in the Restoration Movement, which runs for our congregations from the early 1800s up until today. Nelson has brought us from the end of the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul, you will recall, said there will be a falling away, through the Dark Ages, through the Middle Ages, and all the way up to 1620, when he ended last week with the Pilgrims coming to America. Their purpose in coming was similar in context to what we've been trying to do with the Restoration Movement. So I'm going to be pretty closely tied to these slides today. Nelson and I were talking about this with Bobby Farrell out in the lobby before we started, and the question which keeps coming up is, what do we leave out? There's just so much material to cover. In the event that you would like to move deeper into this, there is a Wikipedia page that covers the Restoration Movement. I don't know who the author was, but I can tell you it was written by some member of the Churches of Christ. And then in addition to that, if you do a Google search on the Restoration Movement, there is an entire series by a man named Scott Harp, who lives in Russellville, Kentucky, who covers the entire Restoration Movement. I have an outline, a 7-page outline here of the pages that we are. Here it is, right here, that we're covering in our quarter. But it also has a series of stories about all the people who were involved with it. And I have one slide that I'll show. Don't think it's up to date. That has a list of about 100 people who were involved in one way or another. So we're going to be talking today. I wanted to start with a framing of where we are. When I was growing up, ministers would stand to speak, and they would read a scripture, and they would give me a lesson, and it was without context. When I first began to hear about the Restoration Movement, I considered the Restoration Movement to be in the set of terms I knew. So I'm taking a risk in leading you through some historical things. This is 5th and 6th grade history now, but I'm taking a risk in leading us through this because it may cost me time to finish with Stone. If that's the case, then I'll refer you to them, but I think it is important for us to understand what the conditions were when people were living in those days. So this is where we're headed. I have a slide later. I'm going to show it twice. This is what Nelson and I have agreed that we're going to try to cover this time. So my eyes are not good enough for me to be able to read that, so I'm going to have to do it from here. The Stone Movement, the Campbell Movement, converging of the movements of those two and others, issues that came up along the way. One was Missionary Society. There's a considerable amount of time to be spent talking about the war between the states, or some people called it the War of Northern Aggression, or the Rebellion of 1861, or just a civil war. And once one, here's how they frame it, you can pretty well tell what they think about it. That war is still being fought. If you go to Richmond, Virginia, you can see real quick that war is still being fought today, 2023. So the war between the states, the influence of editors. Nelson has arranged for Neil Anderson to come and speak with us. And I want to impress on me, and I hope the rest of us, how important this is. David Lipscomb and Talbert Fanning started the Gospel Advocate. It was one of the most influential papers in our movement, right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Brother B.C. Goodpasture was editor of the Advocate for a long time, and Neil bought it from him. Neil Anderson editor of the Gospel Advocate, a part of what our movement has been from the beginning. Now, let me try to emphasize everybody who is involved in this movement was seeking a return to the New Testament church. They had gotten enough, if you want to use TV language, just enough of all the additions and all the changes and all the things that men had added to it. Nelson and I talked about this morning as we were outside there, just a discussion of Calvinism is something that could take an entire period, and I have one slide on it. There is the other religious groups, but the works of Calvin. Calvin was a strong personality. He, like Luther, had their own ideas and had important changes to make, but Calvin was wrong, and Luther thought he was wrong. That's not right. Stone thought he was wrong, and others did as well. So we've got the influence of editors. We have lines of division that came along afterwards. One of those issues was the use of instrument in worship, and Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, said in one of the conversations where somebody was trying to bring an organ into the worship service, he said, "Bring it in, that's no problem. I don't have any trouble with that at all, as long as it's neither seen nor heard." So, Knicks, King's X all around. And then there was growth in the 20th century. Brother Goodpasture and Brother Norval Young and Brother Batsell Barrett Baxter were the sources of how the Church of Christ, Churches of Christ, this restoration movement grew in the 60s. The story is told that the Encyclopedia Britannica people would call to Nashville, and they would talk to Brother Goodpasture, and he'd talk to Brother Young and Brother Baxter and to Jim Bill McIntyre, and they would come up with a number as to how we were growing. And so we, there in the 60s, were one of the fastest growing religious groups in the nation. But as we go back and look at that, we're not quite certain today how carefully those were documented. So, and then finally, what about the continuing education efforts of our movement today? Where are we? How closely have we been able to remain to it? And what do we see as a possibility of the future? So, life in the early 1800s, these are just things that you will have recalled from your 5th and 6th and 7th grade history teachers, but steam-powered boats were introduced in 1807 by Robert Fulton. What difference does this make? Okay, we had people who were going, trappers who were getting the pelts. They were taking these on the Ohio River to the Mississippi. They were making flat boats or lashing logs together, and they're going down to New Orleans to sell their products, and then they walk back to Nashville and on north on the Natchez Trace. Okay, Robert Fulton comes along with the steam engine, and he applies that to a boat. So now then, we can come back up the Mississippi River on a steam-powered boat at the flashing speed of 5 miles an hour going north. So that's one of the many things that happened that made life different and better. And this is sort of the fabric of what we're doing. Soon they revolutionized river travel. Steamboat trade dominated the waterways. And the dangers of steamboat travel, such as explosions, sinkings, Indian attacks, and daring steamboat races, captured the imagination of the nation. The separation of church and state issue came along, and you may recall Larry Phelps and some others led us through a series of papers in the classes downstairs a year or so ago. The word separation of church and state does not appear in the Constitution of the United States. But it's part of what Thomas Jefferson wrote. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, in a letter in 1802, Thomas Jefferson used the phrase separation of church and state to describe the establishment of this concept. So the Constitution says, reading on the right, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press on the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for government redress. In 1801, it had been only 12 years since the Constitution had been ratified. Slavery had been in practice since the beginning of civilization. We make a lot of noise here today about slavery and reparations. In the United States, Americans were not the first people to enslave. If you look at the Old Testament, people who were carried away, Israelites who were carried away, were enslaved. It has been a wrong that has been part of the fabric of the human condition from the beginning. Slavery had been in practice since the beginning of civilization. Slavery, while a way of life in the South, was increasingly being debated. Southern economy was driven by agriculture. Slave labor made people rich down here. The Industrial Revolution in 1789 had come to the United States. Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States in 1804. Tennessee became a state number 16 in 1796. So the economic and technological revolution that came along, we had the cotton gin, we had the steam engine we talked about, canals, the Erie Canal was built to help with transportation, railroads in 1869, the factory system. You will remember somebody named Samuel Gompers in 1789 brought the Industrial Revolution from England. He memorized the plans of those machines they had, and that took place up in the north. And so the cotton and tobacco and sugar that we grew in this part of the country was purchased by the people in the north so they could make the fabric that they could sell to other places. So America moved away from the small subsistence-based economy into an era of increasing industrialization, which impacted the society and family structure. So the fabric of the nation is they continued to develop its own democratic ideals. Debates were about the role of the federal government in leading to formation of various political parties, and those changed a number of times. U.S. Supreme Court established the principle that federal laws take precedence over state laws. And through Marbury versus Mathers in 1803, the court established the principle of judicial review, that is, allowed the courts to check the power of the legislative and the executive branches of the government. National culture develops. War of 1812, especially after the War of 1812, the temperance movement brought the ban of alcohol. The abolition movement moved to end slavery, and women's rights brought about the concept of voting for women. Thomas Jefferson, in the presidency, acquired the Louisiana Purchase. The Monroe Doctrine brought about the concept of if you as an external agency attack us, our ships on the high seas, we'll consider that to be an act of war. This picture here, color's not that great. The picture here shows, I can't get to it. I'm not sure how to operate this. This shows on the right hand side here the states, and then the purple part here shows the organization. This orange and yellow here is what the United States is made up of. Tennessee was the most recent state to come in 1796. As new states joined the nations, the debate over slavery dragged on. In an attempt to appease both the North and the South, Henry Clay crafted what you may recall as the Missouri Compromise, and the words about that were 54 or 40 or fight. That was a line. After that, slave states did not come in. This is a sort of a map of of the Restoration movement. If you can read the words up on the upper left-hand corner, there's Cane Ridge, where we'll talk about today, and then there was the last will and testament of the Cane Ridge and the Declaration of Address. These are documents that are important to our movement and involve Stone and Campbell. So then we move from there to the death of Barton W. Stone. So the Christians are in the blue, the disciples of Christ. The United Movement is the big orange portion. There's the Christian Church and Disciples. The American Missionary Society was a big issue for us. The Churches of Christ and the Christian churches. In 1906, all of those three split out, and the Churches of Christ continued. So that map sort of helps us make sense of it. The American Revolution brought about the idea of restoring primitive Christianity after the American Revolution. This desire to restore a pure form of Christianity played a role in the development of many groups during this period, known as the Second Great Awakening. These included Baptists and Shakers. Now, the Shakers, because of their beliefs, didn't last very long. When the Campbells resisted what they saw as spiritual manipulation of camp meetings, the southern phase of the awakening was an important matrix in Barton Stone's movement, and it shaped the evangelistic techniques both by Stone and Campbell. Campbell was educated in Scotland. He was more academic. Stone was more a man of the heart and a bit more emotional, and there was some difficulty and conflict between the two of them at the outset, but they were able to work through those and ameliorated each of their sets of ideas. Unlike the Puritans, and the Puritans came with the concepts of wanting back to the New Testament. I'm going to start at both the great founding documents of the movement are authentically ecumenical. The last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, which is Stone wound up being called on to adopt the Presbyterian Confession of Faith. And he said, I can go along with it as long as I see, but then when they got down to the points of Calvinism, which we'll touch a little bit later, he said, I can't do this. And so they withdrew from that presbytery, which is an organizational tool of the Presbyterian Church, and started their own presbytery, which didn't have those things in it. So they dissolved their exclusive Presbyterian relationship to sink into the union of the body of Christ at large. So this is when Stone and Campbell come together. So the last will and testament takes away the presbytery. The Declaration and Address, a little bit later, by Campbell, brings those two together. James O. Kelly was an early advocate of seeking through the New Testament through return to Christianity. He and Elias Smith predated Campbell and Stone. Kelly's movement was primarily in North Carolina and Virginia. And Elias Smith was another. He was from Vermont. They believe that members should simply look to the scriptures alone without being bound to human traditions and denominations that were brought over from Europe. So the Restoration Movement, or Stone-Campbell movement, is a Christian movement that began in the United States on the frontier from 1790 to the 1840 in the early 19th century. The pioneers of this movement were seeking to reform the church from within and the unification of all Christians into a single body patterned after the New Testament church. The Restoration movement developed from several independent strands of religious revival and idealized early Christianity. And then this, again, is the map that we talked about earlier. Barton W. Stone was born to John and Mary Stone in 1772, Port Tobacco, Maryland. During his childhood, he grew up in the Church of England. The Baptist then had Baptist, Methodist, and Episcopal church influences as well. Two of Stone's relatives were signers of the Declaration of Independence. Another relative of Stone's was governor of the province of Maryland under the British. Preachers representing Baptists and Methodists came to the area during the Second Great Awakening, and Baptist and Methodist chapels were founded across the country. Stone continued at the Guilford Academy in North Carolina, and then he went on to Georgia. He studied with James McCready, and then later he became a Presbyterian minister. But here we're talking about Stone and the Westminster Confession. As Stone looked more deeply into the beliefs of Confession of Faith, he doubted some of the church beliefs were truly biblical based. He was unable to accept Calvinistic doctrines, inherited sin, total depravity, unconditional election, and predestination. That is Calvinism, that's Presbyterianism in a nutshell. He also believed that Calvin's alleged theological sophistication had been bought at the price of fomenting division and blamed it for producing 10 different sects within the Presbyterian tradition alone. So you can think about the Presbyterian church divided 10 ways. So in 1801, there was the Cain, this is up in Kentucky, and the building still stands. Nelson showed us a picture of it first two times he spoke. Planted the seed to the movement to the Kentucky, and it went all the way to Ohio River Valley. They disassociated from denominationalism. In 1803, Stone and others withdrew from the Kentucky Presbytery. We talked about that earlier. And then they went on to write the last will and testament of that, and that dissolved them where Stone and Campbell movements could join. Now, this is a picture as it stands today of the Cane Ridge Meeting House. That has been made into, I don't want to use the word shrine, but I can't think of a better word. It has been preserved, and this is it on the inside, and a stone masonry building has been built all around that. You can see it. Stone began at 1801 at Cane Ridge, and they called themselves Christians. Campbell began in western Pennsylvania with the same Thomas Campbell, his father, and Alexander Campbell, the son. Now, these gentlemen, again, were classically educated in Scotland. Let me be careful not to leave an impression that Barton W. Stone was not well educated. He was well educated. He took, after his father died, his father's will, his father was a landowner, died when Barton W. Stone was 7 years old. His father's will said that his estate should be divided among the 10 children and the wife, so it was divided 11 ways, and Stone took his money and got himself an education. He wanted to be a lawyer, but as he began to become involved with these preachers, he let that aside and decided he wanted to become a minister of the gospel. Stone began at Cane Ridge in 1820, and we were identified as Christians. Campbell began in western Pennsylvania. Christianity should not be divided, they said. Christ intended one church. Creeds divide, but Christians should be able to find agreement standing on the Bible from which we believe all creeds but human expansions are wrong. The Bible, Nelson and I talked in our class by Lee Strobel called The Case of Christ, and there was some discussion about some language that Paul had in the book of Corinthians about, well, maybe this is a creed. A creed is what we believe. And I don't have a problem if somebody wants to call Paul's language a creed. So, other key principles that had to do with this, they came up with the idea of the Christian church or the Church of Christ. There were also Methodists and Lutherans and Baptists, all of whom were involved in this growth. Christ is the supreme authority in religion. The New Testament is the only faith and practice, rule of faith and practice, eliminating creeds. The understanding of the Old Testament divisions is important. The local congregation is autonomous. Christians are called one body, the Church of the New Testament. Some descriptive terms that you will recall having heard from when we were growing up. We speak where the Bible speaks, and we're silent where the Scripture is silent. The Church of Jesus Christ is essentially, intentionally, and constitutionally one. We are Christians only, but not the only Christians. In essentials, unity; in opinions, liberty; in all things, love. No creed but Christ, no book but the Bible, no law but love, no name but the divine. We do Bible things in Bible ways, call Bible things by Bible names. Common beliefs of both of these groups, the disciples, Campbell's group and Stone's group: Jesus is Christ, as the Son of God. We must keep the Lord's Supper on the first day of each week. Baptisms of adult believers for the remission of sins is in order. That was a major issue for Barton W. Stone. It took him a long time to move away from baptism of babies. And when he finally got there, he went about converting some of the people with whom he tried. As a matter of fact, he tried to convert one of the people who believed that baptism of babies was scriptural, and they wound up converting him. We abandon all denominational labels and we use biblical names. Return to New Testament Christianity. These are things we're looking for in our restoration movement. Now, this is a painting, a watercolor painting of a camp meeting. And you'll notice in this depiction of it, there are 4 or 5 people up there preaching. There's a large crowd, and behind that are a number of tents. Now, Alexander Campbell had a problem with this. He felt like these were just too emotional, too much going on. And if you look there at the very front center of this, there's some people gathering over somebody who's been emotionally overcome, and they fell out and were writhing and we'd say carrying on. Both groups sought to restore the Christian church based on visible patterns set forth in the New Testament. Both believed that creeds kept Christianity divided. So in 1832, Stone and Campbell joined their movements together with a handshake. And you will recall that we discussed the last will and testament that Stone and his group had when they dissolved their presbytery. And the other is a declaration and address, and this is a little publication made in 1969 that has both of those in it. Declaration and address is the Campbell's concept of how the church should work. So the defining event of Stone wing of the movement was the publication of the last will and testament and of the Springfield Presbytery in 1804. This brief document announces their withdrawal from the Presbyterianism and their intention to be solely part of the body of Christ. The writers appeal for the unity of all who follow Jesus, suggests the value of congregational self-governance. We don't have a group in Rome. We don't have a headquarters in Nashville. There are churches that do. The Methodists and the Anglican Church have some headquarters here. Each congregation is governed by its own set of elders. The writers appeal for unity of all who follow Jesus. They suggest the value of congregational self-governance and declare the Bible as a source of understanding for the will of God. They denounce as divisive the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is where Stone was moved out of the presbytery and had started his own. So that's all I have. Are there any questions, any disagreements? Next week, you'll do Campbell? Okay. Any questions? Any stories? Thank you very much.